Good day, everybody. My name is Mike Beam. I'm CIB's program director, and on behalf of Debbie Gray, who's here, who's our communications and marketing coordinator, we want to welcome you to this seminar hosted by Jeremy Gibbert, who's the coordinator of our commission on smart and sustainable built environment. Really want to thank Jeremy for leading this, and has a great group of presenters who he is going to present today, and we are really just thrilled about that. And I believe that Jeremy, perhaps Don just joined us. Perhaps Don Ward, our Chief Executive Officer of CIB, has been working on some sustainability types of issues within the built environment. And Don, would you like to say a few words about some of CIB's initiatives in the built environment before we hand it over to Jeremy? Welcome, Don, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Mike. Is it possible to allow me to share just a couple of slides?
I can do that. You should have things now. Well, welcome to all who are coming in. Looks good, Don.
Okay, yeah. Great. Thanks, Michael, and welcome everybody, and congratulations to Jeremy and W116 for organising this webinar today. I just thought it was worth a quick summary about CIB and some of our alignment with sustainable built environments. The International Council for Building, Conseil International du Bâtiment, with a global network for collaboration and innovation in the built environment, as I hope all of you know. But maybe what you don't know is that we were founded under the auspices of the United Nations as an NGO in 1953. And what that means for us is that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really the crucial ultimate vision of what we're all about. And how we're describing CIB's mission today is to maximize the contribution that research and innovation can make in our sector to the attainment of these goals. So I think the work of this commission, as well as the work of several other of our commissions, to be fair, is therefore absolutely critical if CIB is to achieve that mission on behalf of the research and innovation community around the world. I mean, we have over 40 working commissions, but by far, but must be more than half of them are focused on some aspect of sustainable built environment. Jeremy's is obviously the one that is right in the middle of that, but increasingly this is where research is focused around the world, and our newest two task groups are on nature-based solutions and on zero carbon, net zero carbon. So you can see that this is, a major direction of travel for the research community in general. The three initiatives I just wanted to draw your attention to, Jeremy, because it's just possible that there were people in this webinar who will find it helpful to know that CIB has these connections, and who knows, maybe you want to take advantage of them and just get in touch with Mike or Debbie or myself or Jeremy, to connect into these. And they are the Sustainable Built Environment Conference Series, the Globe Consensus, and the work to support development following that consensus, and our membership of the Global ABC, the Global Alliance for Building and Construction. The conference series is a partnership with IASBE, FIDIC, CIB and UNEP, and involves 8 or 10 conferences every 2 or 3 years, culminating in a global conference, which next year is in Canada. The Globe Consensus is as a result of a partnership between the 6 global civil and structural engineering organizations that you can see there under the heading of Liaison Committee. And it is a statement by a lot of researchers and industry partners about the goals that they believe in and the actions that are necessary to achieve the SDGs. And finally, as many of you will know, the Global ABC is the United Nations vehicle for making sure that there is a proper input from the buildings and construction sector into the Congress of the Parties, the COP27, COP28 conferences, in order to make sure that our sector plays more than its part in meeting the ambitions of the Paris climate goals. The more information on all of those available from the Secretariat, please do get in touch if you want to know more about any of them. I see them, broadly speaking, as being about knowledge sharing, research and collation of research, and policy influence. Finally, Jeremy will mention it later, I'm sure. I look forward to seeing many of you as part of the World Building Congress in a month's time. It's the 22nd World Building Congress since 1955, I think the first one, and the first to be a hybrid event. So if you're not able to join us in person, I hope you're able to join us online. See you there, and thanks a lot, and wishing you a very successful webinar.
Thank you, Don. Jeremy, you have the floor, my friend, to begin this wonderful event. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Don and Mike. Just to confirm, I am Jeremy Gibbard and coordinator of W116 on smart and sustainable built environments. Don gave a very nice introduction, but just from a kind of researcher an academic point of view, sometimes you feel like you're working in isolation. So one of the kind of big advantages of being part of the CIB and some of these working groups is really to kind of share ideas and look and explore different ways of addressing major research problems. So that's really kind of one of the main points of this seminar this afternoon, is just to share some thinking. Our three presenters have done a huge amount of work in their respective areas. And this is an opportunity to share those ideas and hopefully have a bit of a discussion at the end. So the three presentations we have really look at three different approaches to addressing climate change, to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So to start off with, David is going to talk about a very simple approach, which is about building less. And although it seems a kind of very obvious solution, it's surprising how little it's been addressed in major policies, strategies, etc. So there's a very interesting aspect there, very important approach, and what will take to make sure it gains traction. What are the key issues there? What we will then have after David is Asha, who will talk about circular economy approaches, and really this emphasis on reducing consumption and waste and helping regenerate natural environment, natural systems. Last, we'll have William, who's going to talk about energy in buildings and really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how technology can be used to make change happen. So you can see we've got some very different approaches, some very different ideas, and what I'm hoping is that stimulates thinking and some good discussion and questions at the end. So the format of the afternoon will be as follows. First of all, we'll have the three presentations, which will take about an hour. I will introduce each of the presenters, who will have about 20 minutes to present. At the end of the presentations, we will then have discussion and questions. Please note down any questions you might have, or type them into the chat box. And then what we'll do is we'll run through those at the end. Good. Okay. So I think we can then start. I'll give a quick introduction to David. Maybe David, you can see if you can share your screen and get ready to start. So David Ness is a adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on avoiding demand and drastically reducing consumption and carbon in the built environment. He was part of the team that won the Arab 2017 Global Research Challenge and developed a cloud platform for reuse of components as a service, and has worked extensively advising the UN on eco-efficient, integrated and inclusive infrastructure. He's also been very busy publishing recently. So recent publications are the impact of overbuilding on people and planet, 2021, the shift from new build to renovation, 2021, and the growth in floor area, the blind spot in cutting carbon in 2020. So we look forward to David's presentation. Please feel free to start when you're ready, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy, and for a very nice introduction. Sufficiency, cutting carbon by doing less. I want to highlight a problem that greatly concerns my colleague Ke Jing and myself, especially with commercial property. Huge growth in real estate floor area continues all around the globe, as the industry believes it can continue building and yet be sustainable. But this flies in the face of the recent International Panel for Climate Change report on mitigation. So let's start. So can building big be green and carbon neutral? Sydney's Barangaroo, which you can see on the right in the big picture, including a casino, if you don't mind, on the left, is around 535,000 square metres floor area. But it still gained a 6-star Australian Green rating, which is the highest achievable. And it was recognised by C40 Cities for Climate Change as a climate positive and carbon neutral exemplar. Furthermore, Hudson Yards in New York, which you can see on the far right there, is even bigger. It's 1.7 million square metres, and that was awarded the LEED Gold certification. A major building binge. So the US-based Climate Leadership Forum, actually which I happen to be a member of, claims we are in the midst of the major building binge in human history. We won't stop creating buildings, but we can pivot, make them part of the solution, such as by building in timber or nature-based solutions and so on. But unbelievably, the industry expects to construct another New York City every month, actually every 34 days, until 2060. You can see New York there. So imagine that. But these claims are grossly misleading. Carbon embodied in construction is often understated or overlooked, and the green building metric of kilograms carbon dioxide per square metre doesn't constrain size. So a per capita or similar metric is required. And there are questions whether building in timber can actually save and store carbon. A colleague of mine, Olivia Elamine from Austria Real Estate in Germany, has challenged this, some of the claims for building in timber. We can maybe discuss that later. So the urgent need to bend the curve. Meanwhile, the International Panel for Climate Change stresses that aggressive and immediate mitigation policies with rapid and deep changes in demand are required to bend the emissions curve by 2025 and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So that's a very strong message from the IPCC. And the cute diagram from Petit Esquisse says it all, I think. Working together, we must put lots of effort into dragging down the curve by 2025. So not 2030, not 2050. We need to make a drastic change by 2025. Sorry, I'll just go back again. I missed something I wanted to say. And this applies not just to climate, but other forms of pollution and biodiversity loss. And not just to buildings, also to lifestyles, including mobility, our food, clothing, etc., and also, of course, infrastructures. But to achieve 50 to 60% cuts in building carbon by 2030, as UNEP argues we need, drastic and different actions are required. So is sufficiency the answer? Yamina Saheb, who's a really inspirational lead author in the IPCC, is largely responsible for introducing and defining sufficiency in the mitigation report for the first time within Chapter 9 buildings, also in the summary for policymakers. So the report states, sufficiency policies avoid demand for energy, materials, land and water while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. And this is complemented by a new Chapter 5 in the report, which emphasises demand-side mitigation and new ways of providing services can help avoid, shift and improve final service demand. This relates well to the donut economy idea, which many of you would have heard about, developed by Kate Raworth, based on research by Leeds University. There are two limits for sufficiency. The upper limit, here's the donut. The outer edge of the donut represents planetary boundaries or the ecological ceiling. So you can see the ecological aspects, climate change, biodiversity loss, land conversion, they're going beyond the outer boundary, which is exceeding the boundary. The lower limit, the inner edge, represents human well-being, including health, sanitation, food, housing, education, income, etc., which is known as the social foundation. And in regard to that, we don't want to have a shortfall with poverty, etc. So the idea is that we all need to live within the donut, a fair consumption space for all. But beyond housing, which actually gets a fair bit of attention in the IPCC report, sufficiency in the built environment, especially the commercial real estate sector, seems to have flown under the radar. And sufficiency in building, as I've noted there, includes repurpose and optimise use of existing buildings, reduce the number and floor area of new builds, and maximise use of shared space. Brings us to the proposition, sufficiency in construction. Yamina Saheb wrote, the role of human activities in global warming is unlikely to be reduced unless sufficiency is made the primary principle in climate mitigation scenarios and policies in a what's called a sufficiency, efficiency and renewables framework, which you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side. Yamina argues this reduces the cost of buildings without reducing well-being. And also, while efficiency is incremental, sufficiency can achieve a major shift. Pardon me. So I wish to put forward this proposition. We can only bend the curve by 2025 if we drastically reduce the amount of new construction and floor area by not building at all, building less, or adapting existing stock, and if we begin in the global north. The importance of early decisions in achieving this. To make drastic cuts by 2025, we must influence upfront, excuse me, strategic decisions. This carbon reduction curve, it's actually from 2013, but it's also reflected, I think, in the standard PAS 2080, shows more carbon can be reduced in the early stages of projects, especially upfront carbon associated with new construction. As I understand, this is responsible for around 70 to 80% of life cycle embodied carbon. A build nothing decision in the early planning phase may achieve 100% reduction by challenging the need, excuse me again, and exploring alternatives to achieve the desired outcomes. While build less may achieve 100%, build less can reduce carbon by 80% by using or adapting existing assets. And going down further, building efficiency or build clever, such as with low carbon materials, including timber, can only achieve 20 to 50%. But this bottom area is where the industry is focused. But a 50 to 60% cut in carbon is required by 2030, as I said before. So I'm arguing that our attention must really shift to this top area, the top left. So what are current policies and what kind of shift is required? Circularity and net zero, not enough. You may not agree with this, but this is what I truly believe. Current practices are a long way from sufficiency, as we saw in the first slide, showing growth in commercial real estate. And although sufficiency is related to circularity, the IPCC states, quote, claims on the benefits of circular economy for sustainability and climate change mitigation have limited evidence. This may be because circular economy, as practiced, often does not achieve absolute reduction in consumption carbon and is seen, such as by Ellen MacArthur herself actually said, it's seen as offering better growth, not avoiding and reducing consumption and growth. But circular economy, of course, has its place. And my colleague Ke-Jing and I, as Jeremy mentioned in the intro, we cooperated with ARIP in adapting circular economy to the built environment and developed a platform for reuse of components. But Yamina Saheb argues in this report on the right-hand side that sufficiency and circularity should be in tandem. But, and I emphasise this, but with sufficiency first as the main focus. Similarly, claims of net zero carbon often fail to account for embodied carbon, although interest in embodied carbon and metrics are, of course, increasing. And to bend the curve by 2025, we cannot rely on offsets, which take time to be effective. We have less than 3 years. The other reason for a drastic change in policies and practices is inequity, as discussed in the next slide, towards the fair consumption space for all. Overconsumption by the rich was highlighted at the Rio Agenda 21 conference in 1992, 30 years ago, as symbolised by the striking champagne glass diagram. So the idea is the rich are at the top and they hang around sipping champagne, whereas at the bottom of the stem are the poor. But the richest 10% are responsible for 50% of resource consumption and around the same quantity of emissions. The IPCC says that sufficiency should begin in the global north, where we have already consumed too much, far more than necessary for social livelihoods, while often exceeding planetary boundaries. That is, going outside the donor. But it should also be applied in the global south, where more shelter, infrastructure and services must be provided. To reduce emissions, the IPCC says the north should focus on improving the existing building stock, so retrofitting in the north, the wealthier societies, while most opportunity for mitigation lies in the south. But as we have seen, as I've tried to show, the construction and property industry, particularly commercial real estate in the north, continues to build excessively. This is just unfair and it's totally unsustainable. The IPCC says that sufficiency will help reduce inequalities, which is, of course, Usha would know, Sustainable Development Goal 10, lead to more responsible consumption and production, SDG 12, and benefit other goals. In fact, in the report, there's a table indicating how sufficiency and other mitigation strategies can influence the different goals. So, making a paradigm shift. The IPCC is that consuming less and differently can actually be good for people on the planet. So can sufficiency be positive and not punitive? Making a paradigm shift should come really from society and businesses, supported by policy drivers and incentives from governments and the like. First, from a social and business perspective, on the left, we need to focus on delivery of services with the least physical assets. In fact, COVID responses have shown the potential for smart digital solutions, such as e-business, online education, etc., reducing the need for new physical real estate, one would think, while delivering even better services with cost savings. Policy drivers on the right-hand side and incentives for the building sector pardon me, may involve carbon budgets, their allocations. The form of green rating systems, I regard that as a priority. Actually, my colleague Kerjing and myself has discussions with the Green Building Council in Australia and ARIT along those lines. We'd like to take that further. And another policy is introducing a necessity test for new projects that questions their use value, especially for commercial capital formation projects. So if you look back at that, the first slide in the Barangaroo and the casino, you know, the necessity test might argue, look, do we really need to build a casino when we've got other priorities, especially in the global south? In fact, Olivia Ellermein from Austria Real Estate argues strongly that in the global north, we really need to constrain building of offices, hotels and shopping centres. And also at the bottom of the policy drivers, I shouldn't forget, we need incentives to make existing spaces and buildings work harder. At the bottom there, just quickly, the French Agency for Ecological Transition has published very useful scenarios about various degrees of efficiency, and I strongly recommend that. Just to finish off, and I'll be very quick, to return to the original proposition, you know, can we bend the curve by 2025 by building less while still meeting social and business needs, especially in the global north? How can we achieve radical system change to avoid demand and consumption while ensuring well-being for all? And secondly, should commercial real estate, new commercial real estate, which arguably has less social value, be targeted initially to drastically reduce consumption and carbon? Actually, a French degrowth economist, Timothy Parrique, argues that dismantling or constraining a large part of the economy that serves no social value, such as commercial real estate, should be a priority. In smart solutions such as digitalisation deliver business and other services with less physical assets, less carbon, as with COVID, as I mentioned, and how to shift from building new to stewardship and repurposing of what we have. And finally, I think a quite important question for this discussion is the relationship of sufficiency and circularity. So I think I'll finish there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And I think you've given us a lot of interesting material, controversial ideas. So I'm hoping that people are noting down some good questions for the end. So thank you very much. We are now moving on to Asha. So Asha, if you can put up your presentation and I'll give you an introduction. So Asha is Professor of Sustainable Built Environment at RMIT University in Australia and is the co-lead of the UN Sustainable Building and Construction Program. She has many years of experience in sustainable built environments, working as an academic, a researcher, but also with industry and government. Her most recent role has been with the UN One Planet Network, where she's done a lot of work internationally with organizations like UNEP on SDG 12 and circular built environments, and has been developing some very interesting publications, which I think she's going to share in her presentation. So thank you, Asha. We look forward to your presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I hope you can hear me okay, and you can see my slides as well. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, as Jeremy mentioned, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the work that we did with the One Planet Network, the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program. But also at our MIT University here in Melbourne, it's about 10:30 at night here. We have been working on research looking at circular economy, understanding really what circular economy means for Victorians and for Australians. What is the taxonomy or the language that is used around circular economy, particularly around the built environment. And we've also got research partners that are looking at the interaction between clean energy and climate resilience as part of our discussions in circular economy. So that's where the IC3P platform comes, which is about circular economy, climate resilience and clean energy, and then understanding the ecosystem for circular economy through the Victorian Circular Activator. So I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm speaking here today, which is the Buiwurrung and the Wunwurrung tribes of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands RMIT conducts its business, but also on whose lands I'm currently speaking to you from today. So just a little bit about the work that we're doing with the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, where, as Jeremy said, I'm one of the co-leads, along with the Government of Finland and United Nations Environment Program. So the 10YFP was actually set up after Rio +20 with the aim of accelerating the transition towards sustainability. And it's a pity that, we're almost 8 years into the 10YFP as well, and still a long way to go in terms of the level of urgency. I think is what I'm trying to say is really critical now more than ever before. We've got another 8 years in terms of the new urban agenda to 2030, and yet in terms of the practices, there's still a long way to go, particularly in the buildings and construction industry. So the Buildings and Construction Program is one of 6 programs, and all the other programs you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here. The food systems, sustainable lifestyles and education, buildings and construction, consumer information, tourism, and the public procurement program. So all the 6 programs are seen to be an implementation mechanism of SDG Goal 12, so which is clearly on consumption and production. And it's a multi-stakeholder partnership program where we have got over 700 program partners and a number of different national focal points and different countries that are part of this program. We also are, as a result of this combined initiative, looking to see how we can work not just within our own programs, but also between our programs to assist in providing a coherent direction, tools and solutions for people. So since the commencement of the program, what is it that we have done? We have been in operation for about 7 years now, and our current governance arrangements comes to an end at the end of this year. And as to what will happen and how we carry the momentum forward at this point in time is still a bit unclear. We have been working on circular built environment reports. We published 8 reports in 2020, and I'm sharing some of those findings with you today because we have continued to develop that since then. We have also looked at the development of and bringing in the discourse and narrative around responsibly sourced materials into the discourse for the buildings and construction industry. As I said, we have developed tools, for instance, the Sherpa tool that was picked up by UN Habitat and was partnered initially with with UN Habitat in its development. But that tool, for instance, is looking at how might we bring in economic, environmental, social, and cultural thinking into the planning and design of particularly housing developments. As I said, we have done a number of reports. So in 2020, at the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference, we launched 8 reports, and then we continued developing the work in the form of case studies. So this is collecting case studies from both the developed world as well as the developing world. And we think it's really important to look at some of the indigenous practices in the developing world, because there are some very good examples of sustainability and circularity in them. And then we have continued the work of looking at indicators, and there's lots of indicators, some of which are still in various stages of development, and some that have been quite sufficiently developed, but not necessarily practical in terms of its use. So we have looked at how can we use the current existing sustainable development goals as the indicators for circularity, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Looking at the SBC program in particular, at the moment, we have over 100 program partners or organizations from 50 different countries. And we have got a major project now from Germany, where we're looking at continuing to develop the materials work and the circularity work across India, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Senegal, going up to 2025. So let's just take a moment to pause and really focus on why are we looking at the built environment sector? Why is it so critical? Well, because we know that the built environment is a high resource use sector. It's got a very high environmental impact, but it's also a major source of environment. We know that the built environment consumes about 40% of global raw materials. And it's not just in the construction phase of buildings, which again is a point that David made, but we also need to think about resource use during the operation of buildings. And increasingly now, I think we also need to think about end of life of buildings. So how do we design buildings so that we can also use buildings, we can deconstruct buildings at the end of life and reuse those materials as much as possible, along with some of the other things that David has mentioned, such as changing views or building more modular, flexible buildings, so these buildings can become more multifunctional over periods of time. We also know that in the process of operation of buildings, there's 30% of waste that's generated, and this waste has to go somewhere. So if we can start looking at reducing that waste or moving towards zero waste is something for us to start thinking about. We also know that it's not just about solid waste, but also liquid waste and the use of water in buildings, again, not just at the point of construction of buildings, but also in the operation of buildings. And one of the reasons why the building industry attracts the workforce is because it is quite diverse in terms of the types of skills that it needs. So from the obvious designers, planners, builders, facility managers, and other people that operate buildings, we also need the marketing sector, the property sector, and the real estate sector, and so on. And we also know that in the developing world, that this 10% of the workforce is often much higher because of the informal workers that are part of the building industry, particularly in the developing world. But there are also some alarming notes for us to consider. So, for instance, if you look at the latest OECD reports, we know that if we continued our current trends of the way we continue to use materials and the standard materials that are being used, such as concrete, cement, glass, steel, sand, we know that material use will double by 2060. And again, as David made the point, there are buildings there are cities yet to be constructed, there are buildings yet to be constructed. So about 50 to 60% of those buildings are not built today. And they will be built between now and 2060. And just the production of cement alone, again, based on current trends, can contribute up to 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a real problem on our hands. So what are some of the considerations that we need to put into the discussions and into the narrative? So let's take a look at what circular economy actually means. To me, circular economy is another way of looking at sustainability. The difference between our sort of triple bottom line approach to circular economy, to sustainability, as distinct from circular economy, is that circular economy focuses more on the economic side. So it really brings in some of the opportunities that can sit alongside not just the environmental impact that we have, but driving the economic change as a result of ensuring that we can decouple the environmental impact and the economic impact. So it is actually a good precursor and a good catalyst for the creation of jobs. So essentially, circular economy is about designing out waste, ensuring that we keep materials and products circulating in the system. We don't use virgin materials, or we minimize the use of virgin materials, but we allow the planet to regenerate. So that's really what the premise of circular economy is based on. And why is it important? Because as I've said already, there's a huge amount of materials that are going to be used in buildings and construction. And we really cannot afford to waste any more time in locking in our linear ways of construction. We have to change both the developed world as well as the developing world into a circular system of operation. So what are the advantages if we adopted a circular approach? Well, we will not have to use, or we will not have to rely on the resource use that we've currently had to date. We can at the same time eliminate or reduce environmental impact, but importantly also we can support local jobs. Because we can start thinking about bringing some of that indigenous knowledge, skills, and ways of thinking, which has more or less been eliminated or has disappeared out of largely some of the older cultures and traditions around the world. So here's an opportunity rather than seeing it as a disincentive. So what are some of the ways for us to think about this? We know that some countries have responded to the Paris Agreement through national determined contributions and have put buildings and construction or the power sector front and center of signing up to ensuring that changes are being made within their own countries. But we also know that a lot of work is being done, particularly by the global ABC, but also by UNEP and organizations like the International Finance Corporation, in looking at how can we bring in energy efficiency practices, green codes and green building practices into some of the developing world. And I think that's a really important starting point because it acts as a level playing field. We also need to start thinking about how do we ensure that we start increasing the stringency over a period of time. So it's not a case of we develop building codes or set up building codes and then we don't have a good mechanism in place for ensuring that these policies are actually policed, and so therefore it actually gives us the results that we're looking at in terms of energy efficiency reductions and so on. And we also need to start thinking about the role of planning and building, because our cities don't exist on their own. They're not just a conglomeration of buildings. There's infrastructure, there's mobility. So we need to start thinking about all the different scales, the building scale, the neighborhood scale, as well as at the city scale. And there are some examples currently around the world where, particularly around procurement practices, governments are setting up new trends. Governments being a major player in procurement are setting up some very good examples of ensuring that circularity, material use, sustainability, and some of the principles of circular economy are brought into the government tendering practices so that they can be seen as exemplars pushing the envelope for sustainability and circular economy as much as possible. But then there are also voluntary options. The green building councils across the world are a good example of that. We have also seen leadership by certain councils, by certain industries, by certain governments, showing that they can push the envelope and develop good examples and good practices. There's also importance of the role of assessment schemes, so not just looking at the green building codes, but also looking at, for instance, here in Australia, we have Neighbours, the National Australian Built Environment Rating Scheme, which measures the utility. So it tells you exactly how much waste is being generated, how much water is being used in buildings, and so on. So all these also play an important role. And of course, there are client demands. So increasingly, some of the superannuation companies and some of the companies that have got a conscience and want to demonstrate value to their shareholders, or value and bringing in principles, doing the right thing, or ESG governance, are trying to bring in policies and programs to not just within their own areas of operation, but also ensuring that leadership is demonstrated in the physical building itself. So let's just look at what is the work that we did leading to the state of play reports and the work that we're continuing to do. So it started off with presentations that we made in 2017 and 2019 in a pre-COVID world, where at the World Circular Economy Conference, we started having some discussions focusing specifically on buildings and the built environment. And as I said before, that led to 7 reports and a global report. So the 7 reports looking at Europe, North America, Oceania, Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then in addition to that, we also deployed an international survey where we've now got close to 200 responses from North and South, with about 82 responses from the Global South. And then we validated some of the findings of the surveys through workshops across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So just very quickly, I'll go through some of the recommendations, 10 recommendations that has come out of this 7 regional reports, which we brought together with a global report. Firstly, the really important thing is to start thinking about moving away from linear systems of operation. Because if we don't recognize what the problem is, we're never going to be able to move in the direction of circularity. We believe that using the Sustainable Development Goals is a valid and a good starting point to monitor, to evaluate, to report, and keep that as a way for us to fine-tune and build the stringency over a period of time. As I've said before, we need to think about life cycle at the outset, because we're becoming quite good at energy efficiency. But then if the more energy efficient we become, or as we move towards net zero, the role of materials and the role of embodied energy becomes even more critical. So at the moment, in Europe, and even in some buildings here in Australia, up to 40 to 50% of the full life cycle is about embodied energy. So it becomes really critical to start thinking about how we treat materials, what are these materials that we use, how do we build buildings, how do we ensure that we do not have waste resulting from the process of construction. And with that, procurement processes. So how do we ensure that, for instance, a greater percentage of reused or recycled materials are built into green procurement practices and into the tendering process. An important consideration within all this is that we just cannot focus on mitigation. We have to think about adaptation and resilience as a trifecta, so that we're not in a situation where we're only thinking about mitigation and without considering adaptation and resilience, we are contending with increased climate change problems, for instance, floods, and here in Australia, bushfires. And so we're actually then having to expend more materials, use more materials for the processes of buildings and construction. So this leads us to start thinking about how do we bring in local solutions? How do we adapt some of these local solutions? How do we start thinking about new business models? Do we have to own everything? Can we have models where not everything is owned, but some of these might actually be services that are provided to us and therefore can be outsourced? And with all this comes the issue of capacity building. We need to overhaul our education skills. We need to start thinking about how do we bring in this level of thinking so that the decision makers in 5 years or 10 years time are armed with the knowledge that they need to make considered decisions on behalf of the built environment. So just very quickly, I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. So the results of the survey I'm presenting at 2 levels. One is at the overall goal level, and then at the target and indicator level. So from this slide, you can see that when you look at the global, which is a green color, and then the distinction between the north, which is in blue, and the south, which is in red, you'll note that at a global scale, SDG 8 reflecting economy and SDG 11 on cities scores the highest, whereas SDG 12 is on top both globally and in the north. We also see that SDG 9, SDG 13 are also scoring quite high in the north. SDG 6 on water, SDG 7 is another area that comes into consideration when we think about both the south as well as looking at it from a global context. Then when we look at it at the overall level, we also see that some of the considerations are where the importance of health, importance of biodiversity, and the importance of partnership. So you can see that SDG 17 scores really high globally, whereas SDG 3 scores very high in the south, whereas again SDG 17 scores very highly in the north. In both the north and the south, the role of education is also quite important, and I think this is quite a good signal for us to take away. And given that this is looking at built environment, it's not surprising to see that food, gender, and equality don't score quite as high. When we started looking at an indicator level, we were really keen to understand what are those core indicators that would signal as important for circularity. And what we found was that material footprint, which is the same indicator on 8.4.1 and 12.2.1 is important. So also the rates of recycling and the use of local materials, which sits under 11C1. And then a range of secondary indicators, which are looking at across the board, across water, across energy, across carbon emissions, across cities, across housing, and also on consumption production, but also on climate change. So these are the other 10 secondary indicators that rank very highly in the work that we do. So where to from here? The work that we're doing is now looking at increasing the amount of case studies that we have done. We've gathered case studies, and you'll find all of this on our website. We've got case studies from a number of Asian, African, and South American countries. But we're also looking at, rather than working just with governments, can we also start looking at working with industries and start looking at how can some of these indicators be used for reporting at a project level, because a lot of industries are also looking at how might they report SDGs, and it's a good way to bring bring the project level thinking also into reports that companies may sign up to in terms of agreeing as part of the ESG for reporting on SDGs. Last year we launched the latest report at COP26, but we're now looking at developing that further to scale up beyond the countries that we've got here that were part of our case studies, to include further number of countries and increase the sample of case studies. But we're also interested in not just the north to south learning, but also the south to north learning. And there's some really interesting work that came up in one of our meetings that took place in Amsterdam, where some of the indigenous type of thinking learning can also be applied into the northern context, but also between the south and the south. So I just wanted to let you know that the survey is still open. If you're interested in responding to the survey, we would certainly appreciate that. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take that at the end. And I'll leave it there. I think I went a few minutes over, Jeremy, so apologies. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much, Asha, for a very interesting presentation, very comprehensive. And I think we're going to get also some quite interesting questions as a result. So thank you very much. Next will be Will Swan. Will Swan is a professor and director of the Energy House Laboratories at the University of Salford, where he's led the energy and buildings research for 10 years. The labs he's worked on include the award-winning Salford Energy House, a whole Victorian house in a climate-controlled chamber, the Smart Meters Smart Homes Lab, and the forthcoming 16 million pound, very different, Energy House 2. And Will is also one of the founders of the Building Performance Network, is the chair of the Low Carbon Buildings Challenge Group in Greater Manchester, and is a member of the Retrofit Task Force. So thank you very much. We're looking forward to your presentation. Please go ahead, Will.
Thanks very much. I felt like I overwrote my introduction there a little bit. All right, so my name's Will Swan. I'm the Director of Energy House Labs at the University of Salford. So we established the research area at Salford. It wasn't something we were traditionally known for maybe sort of 15 years ago. Salford very much had a track record in management and IT. And maybe sustainability was something that we did do, but perhaps didn't pick it out as a core subject. So my role in this started in around 2008, 2009, when I was actually operating for the university as a sort of general sustainable construction consultant. And so I was given housing to do something with. And really the sort of genesis of it came around discussions with people in physics and people in engineering and health. And over the years, we kind of developed very specifically. So I think the other two presenters have taken a very, like a global view of it. Really, what we're very much focused on is innovating the product, making the thing the most sustainable it can be. And we very much focused on housing. So, but it wraps up questions of materials, of systems, of the way you install things, commission things, data, and also people in the middle, although we tend to work with social scientists outside. So very much my team, which is about 15 people, are focused on the sort of European housing stock is really where we are, although I will open that up a little bit at the moment with the new facilities. And really it's about decarbonisation, but really we have a focus on energy efficiency, and over the past maybe 5 or 6 years that has come open up into smart energy systems and data as well. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of the 4 labs we have, and I'll break down the ones at either end in a little bit more detail. So Energy House, we built in 2011, and it is a whole house in an environmental chamber. It's a Victorian end terrace. So those of you familiar with the UK housing stock, this is sort of pre-1919, and there's about 20% of the UK are like this, but there are other properties, particularly in Europe, that have similar kind of characteristics, solid walls, you know, heritage buildings that are hard to treat. I'll give a bit more detail on that. We also have a thermal measurement lab where we test coatings, insulation, and we deal with a lot of the big international suppliers there. So in 2018, we opened the Smart Meters, Smart Homes lab, because, and it actually kind of came from the UK installing the smart meter infrastructure. And when we did field work, we thought once the smart meter came in, we'd be able to get all the data. And it was quite a big challenge. So we opened it as a research area. And I think for us, that and low impact materials are probably our two growth areas. And then the last facility, which is sort of an extension of the original Energy House, is Energy House 2, and I'll give you some more detail on that. So in the UK and Europe, Energy House is what we're famous for. Really, we developed it to address the retrofit problem. So, and really it was kind of when we started in 2011, when we constructed it, we were really focusing on the UK. We were quite new to energy in buildings. And so we had buildings experts, we had physics experts, but I wouldn't say we were sort of building physicists or building performance experts. And so really, we were trying to look at retrofit as an innovation problem. And I think where we were seeing what was going on in the UK is there was an awful lot of modelling, and we were saying we were hitting certain targets in terms of energy efficiency or carbon reduction, but actually we were using regulatory, quite light touch models, and we weren't measuring anything to any great extent. I think the thing that we do an awful lot of it is a lot of work with industry, and we do a lot of work with other universities because of the unique nature of the facilities. We do a lot of partnership work, and we're very outward facing. So why is it different? I think there are two ways to test if a product or a system is working outside of the Energy House model. And the first is a bench test. So you create an artificial test cycle with the product in isolation. But what that doesn't do is put it into context. It doesn't tell you how the product operates in the interaction with the whole system. And then on the other side are field trials, and field trials are notoriously expensive and they take a long time. You usually wait some at least really a gold standard is 2 years and 100+ properties. And so we do field trials, and the entry level at that kind of scale is around £250,000. So we kind of thought there might be a different way to do this. And so we came up with the Energy House, which was to get rid of the noise that you get from field trials. It can't replace field trials because obviously there's issues of occupants, different archetypes. But actually what we wanted to do is to find a place where innovators could test products, systems within a real setting under controlled conditions. So we can take it down down to -13 up to +30. We can hold it within ½ a degree, and then there are assorted weather rigs. So we can do rain, solar heat, wind. There are some limitations there, and we do have a snow machine that we break out every now and again. Within the property, there are actuators, so we can turn things on and off. We can put incidental gains in, open doors and windows. The key issue with that is repeatability. And so what we can do is we can take a product, it could be a whole house retrofit, right the way down to a boiler add-on that makes it operate slightly differently. We can test it without, and then we can test it with, and we take one away from the other, and you know how that thing is working, whether it is making a measurable difference. And if you cannot measure a measurable difference within the Energy House, we can, it basically means if you take it out to the field with all the noise, the weather and occupants, it's not going to make a difference in any measurable way. So that gives us a good opportunity for an innovator to basically say, oh no, back to the drawing board with that one. The other thing is because we have that repeatability, we're not waiting for all the weather conditions to roll through. We can do a winter or a summer and repeat it. So quite often we can get useful data in a few weeks. Again, if somebody's got a good product, that allows them to innovate more quickly. I think the third thing I talk about is granularity. So granularity in terms of data. So if you do a field trial, you're probably looking at 10, 12 data points. It's not that many. and really you can tell if something works or it doesn't work. Within the energy house, there's about 300 hardwired sensors, plus we have other rigs. So we can do things like operative comfort, thermal transfer, system performance. And because we have that granularity of data, we can quite often say not only whether something works or not, how it works, why it's not working, and we can see which part of the system something is going wrong. I think the final thing that I'd like to touch on is really about the flexibility, because what we can do is install things that don't work. We can build faults into the system and understand the impact. We can do anything we want to the property. The property's been retrofit top to bottom 3 or 4 times. If there is a product that goes in a house that impacts its energy consumption, it has been in here. Right the way, insulation, fabric systems, controls, doors, windows, boilers, air source heat pumps, batteries, vehicle to grid, smart controls. We had a whole year of smart controls. So we have a really good sense of what works and what doesn't work in retrofit. So I'll just move on, if I can move on. What's going on there? There we go. So this gives a really good example. I'll be really quick here. So this is a project we did in 2013, and it was just a pure fabric retrofit. So we did solid wall insulation to the side and the back of the property, floor membrane and insulation, topped up loft insulation, doors and windows. And then what we were able to do is take one thing off at a time and test it under exactly the same conditions. And this had never been done before. And there was an attempt to do it in the field by Nottingham University, and they just struggled because of the weather conditions. But this was an ability to say, actually, we could do stepwise retrofit. And we understood the risks at the joys, because retrofit's not just about energy efficiency, it's about comfort, it's about building pathology as well. So that's really where we started that kind of retrofit problem. And this was with a partner who funded it entirely themselves, and they did 2 retrofits. This company called Saint-Gobain, who are the world's biggest manufacturer of construction products. And here's a slightly different thing that we were able to do. So when I touch back on that smart, is actually how do we use not just how much energy we use, when we use it, what's its carbon intensity, where it comes from, how can we control and understand it. So what we're seeing in the UK alongside the rollout of the smart meter infrastructure, and this is true in other countries as well, is a rise in the use of electric vehicles. More people having renewables, so an increase in mainly photovoltaic solar panels, and the use of batteries. We're also seeing the electrification of heat. And on top of that, the pricing system is moving, particularly in electricity, to not a fixed price. We're seeing what we call an agile tariff or a half-hourly settlement. So what we have is a very, we've gone away from consuming gas and electricity and paying for it at a fixed rate at a certain time. So people are just being consumers, whereas now people are generating, storing and consuming energy and potentially trading energy and offering network services, i.e. allowing the energy companies to turn items on or off or draw down from their batteries. And we were able to build this really, really quickly. We built this in about 2 months, because we had the existing infrastructure. So we can see there's an air source heat pump, a vehicle to grid charger, which we got from Honda Motorworks, and the instructions came in Japanese, which was very helpful. We had a Tesla battery, that was also quite awkward to use. And we had a Mixergy tank, which is like a smart hot water tank. So it's an intelligent thermal store. And actually so we finished this project about 2019, so it's just before lockdown. And the idea was to control, coordinate, and then optimize. And we pretty much just got to coordinate. And I think really this kind of got us to some of the lessons that we've learned from energy houses, the gap between policy aspirations and what's going on the ground. Because actually there was a lot of work saying we could do these types of things, but actually how easy was it to physically do? We had to open the door of the Nissan Leaf every half an hour to keep it within the system, otherwise it shut down. So a lot of these, what they're now calling energy smart assets, particularly in the UK, there is a new standard approaching. actually optimize for themselves, when actually what a consumer needs to do is have an optimized domestic energy system. So that's a really interesting area that we started working on. So when we get to 2021, we're all a little bit more informed about the situation. So we've been around for sort of 10 years, or probably a little bit longer now, probably coming at 13. So really the issues that we're interested in have moved on a little bit. So it's broader, there's a much bigger team. Obviously there's 15 of us now, 4 laboratories, as well as external research work. So we're thinking about decarbonisation, but we're also thinking about adaptation, and we're particularly interested in issues around overheating and climate change and the response of energy efficiency buildings to that. We think modern methods of construction are probably going to be fairly essential to deliver the future home standards that we need. Low impact materials, once we get operational energy down, embodied energy is, and there is a new part of the building regulations in the UK called Part Z, where a life cycle assessment of the embodied carbon is going to be considered. Energy system transitions, so a move away from gas, which is still more than 85% of the UK stock, and all the way through Europe, to electricity, clean electricity and decarbonised electricity, potentially hydrogen, maybe not in housing, and also things like district heating. I think the other thing that's bearing down on industry is it's getting cheaper to measure buildings. There's a lot of things throwing out data, so understanding the real performance of buildings, not what we've modelled in our model, you know, either in our static models. So we have a regulatory model in the UK called the Standard Assessment Procedure, which is a simple building physics model, right the way to, you know, dynamic models. That's different from measuring real performance. And then I think the opportunities and the risks around digitization and Internet of Things. So our kind of response to that is very much about trying to sort of bring more of these things into a systems integration, which is somebody's home, essentially. So Energy House itself, I mean, it's been very good for us. At one point, we had a 14-month waiting list. Our current waiting list is about 6 months. But the limitations are fixed UK archetype. So it's 20% of the UK. And we have plenty of people coming in saying, yes, we really like the idea, but we don't have any of these where we come from. And I think that's kind of made us a little bit parochial in the type of work we do. We have limited environmental conditions, probably C.1. It's actually future climate is going to be more difficult, but actually, you know, how do we deal with Scandinavian climates and northern Arctic climates? How do we deal with Mediterranean? How do we deal with Middle Eastern? We don't have ground conditions. You can see in the picture there, it's on a concrete plinth, massively under-researched area. The other thing is we can't do permanent changes to it. So if we can't get it back to its original state, we can't do anything on it with it. So things like coatings or some of those innovations where, you know, you can't get off the fabric, we've had to step away from. The sort of fifth big point is there's limited space around there, and some of the environmental conditions, particularly wind, don't work as well as we would like to. But also it's for things like tours, engagement with students, engagements with industry visits. Because it wasn't a purpose-built chamber, it used to house a physics experiment, there is a lack of access and viewing. And I think the other thing is we're only ever really dealing with the product manufacturers, and that in many respects is not necessarily the problem, it's where it all comes together. So I'm just going to go through this slide very quickly. I'm aware I'm running over a little bit. So this is, I might skip on a little bit as well. So this is a visualization of the facility that we've built now. And so really what we have is 2 large chambers. So this, in terms of chamber volume, is 20 times the size of Energy House 1. And I think they're 2 of the largest environmental chambers in Europe. So the idea is that we can go in and we can build whatever we want. We can build small commercial. Actually, Energy House 1 was built by carrying everything down the corridors of a university building. And when we sort of accept the scale of the problem, actually that's not a very professional way to operate. So what we can see here is we've got 2 houses in each of the chambers. We're just entering a demonstration fits period where we will be building actually 2 houses in one chamber and a passive house flat in the second chamber. So you can see with the cutaway, the scale. The idea as well is we can also get cars in there as well, because we see EVs as part of the energy system. And then we've opened up the weather conditions. So -20 to +40, which we can do under control. So that's still keeping it within 0.5 degree. Although we do have the ability to go higher and lower, but it's the 95% of the global population. And actually 40 degrees is really where we decided that heat stress can start kicking in. So I'll move a little bit further down here. Out. A second. So as I'm aware, I'm running out of time. So there's nothing I hate more than somebody showing me a simulation of something. So this is drone footage of what we've actually built. So this is right at the end of the building period. We have actually commissioned, and we will be starting constructing inside on June the 6th with the first 2 houses. So we're building 2 just UK starter homes with the UK's first and 4th biggest house builders who are working together. And I think that's actually a reflection of what's happening in UK policy, particularly. In that developers are actually having to invest in research and development now, which is something they've never done before. So you can see it's actually one of the few buildings that I've seen that ever closely matches the visualization. And this is kind of the front of the building. So you can see there is a central core and then 2 large chambers at the outside. The whole build was about 76 weeks. It's largely, you can see the chambers here, and you can see actually, so the buildings will be built on an insulated pit, which is isolated from the ground. And we can see some of the HVAC equipment. So of the 12 million build, about £6 million of it was heating, ventilation and air conditioning equipment. So there are 2 identical plant rooms above each of the chambers, which I think are just towards the end of this demonstration. So you can see the plant room being constructed here. So from our point of view, this kind of opens up international, it opens up any building or house type to open up those principles that we found very successful in the retrofit space. So we really feel that we've got a year of demonstrators, so we'll have those 3 properties in there for a year so that people can understand principle. And then in the following year, so from July 2023, we'll start commencing products, and we're working with partners now to pull products together. So if you bear with me a second, I'll go to my last slide. Go to the next slide. There we go. And that's me. Thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Will. Very interesting presentation, and very nice to kind of see the kind of detail that you're working at.
Yeah.
What we're now going to do is I'm hoping that everybody's thoughts noted down some of the questions, because I'm sure there are many ideas, there are many issues that people may want to talk about and ask questions about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 1 or 2 questions just to start off with. And then I think, Mike, maybe if you can help identify questions from participants, and also we can have a look at the chat to see what questions there are there. But to start off with, this is a question I think for David, Asha and Will. You've all presented, very different approaches. And one of the things, that you've all covered is this urgency. So, what is the scale of this problem? The scale of this problem is that literally in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there has to be very substantial change, very significant change in terms of how the built environment performs. If we are to do anything about climate change, if we have to bend the curve or make any sort of impact. And the same with the Sustainable Development Goals. If we look at a lot of the trajectories, very few countries are actually going to achieve all of them, and many are going to miss a lot of them. And that's across the board. Whether you're in Sweden or Malawi, there just isn't the traction that has to happen. And I think the built environment probably is one of the areas that is really lagging. And I think one of the things that we really need to do, given that urgency, is to say what very specific practical things, measures can we start doing now, doing quickly, and just getting on with, so that we can build some momentum around change. So I hope it's not unfair. I'm going to ask each of you just for one or two very specific practical measures that, if you were given the opportunity by government, by the UN, by corporates, you know, what would your kind of key measure in terms of 2 or 3 things that we can start with at a very practical level straight away, so that we hopefully start building momentum to achieve sufficient change. And I'm open. Anyone can answer that. I don't know whether Will, Asha, David, do you want to have a go?
It's a nice big tough question, isn't it? I think really, because what we have to think about is carbon budgets. It's the rate at which we get to net zero is as important as getting there in some respects. So you know, I'm an expert in my field, so I won't suggest to speak for everybody on this. For me, really, policy and government commitment is a big driver, and those of you in the UK will remember in 2016 we abandoned the whole series, a raft of policy decisions that I think, if had been in place, would have made the UK built environment look not a radically different place, but there would have been lots of little things that would have been done that would have left us in a better position. Because, like, sustainability and delivering a sustainable built environment is, you know, I'm a sort of more of a technical person these days. We kind of stick a screwdriver in things, but it's a socio-technical problem. So, you know, it's not just, you know, if I come up with a brand new mousetrap that helps retrofit a house and gets it to nearly net zero, and it's technically efficient, it's low impact, you know, it's low embodied energy, there are a whole raft of issues in terms of policy, finance, skills, you know, regulation, professional, you know, professions, because I think some of the professions are not as far ahead on this stuff as they ought to be as well. You know, education, the things that go on the universities, things that go on the schools, the skills, infrastructure. So what we do have, I think, with sustainability generally is a market failure. In some respects, we don't have the structures that are needed to deliver. And I'll agree with David, there is an element of virtue signaling and performativeness in trying to deliver a net zero built environment. You know, I know plenty of buildings that have, let's say, high performing LEEDs or BREEAMs or gold stars, and you only have to point the thermal camera at them to know that these things aren't happening. So I think it's lots of little things need to happen, but ultimately it's about a systemic change. I think you're starting to see some of that, but it does feel like too little too late. And actually, if we think of it as an existential crisis, then it's kind of got to start with a shift of the landscape in terms of socio-technical action, where it is considered, you know, if not you know, the most important, but then at least one of the 2 or 3 most important things we should be dealing with as a society. So it's not, I don't think, I wish I had an easy answer, you know, I wish I could say, oh, you turn their boiler down 1 degree, we'd all be fine, but it isn't like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's very useful. So I think part of what you're saying is that, you know, it just hasn't got the priority. And then also, I think in terms of kind of government and policy and filtering through all the elements, all the aspects, and making it all work together in terms of systemic change.
I would say if you shaped good policy, so in 2016 we were supposed to have net zero homes, and you could tell, because we're very industry facing, that nobody took it seriously and nobody thought it was coming. Now we have a future home standard. The fact that I see the house builders and developers running so quickly to try and meet that standard and gather evidence and work out how to do it, it tells me that that policy is being taken seriously. But, you know, 6 years too late, and probably 20 years too late in many respects, but 6 years too late when we all knew it was a problem. So I think it's just pushing that problem right up the agenda and aligning up the various interacting systems to deliver that, because there's no point, and I'll give a really good example from the UK, because, you know, that's where I do most of my business. There's a policy statement that said we would install 600,000 air source heat pumps a year, in a national policy statement. Last year, we installed 30,000, and we installed over 1 million gas boilers. No, and that tells you that even though if there's a policy aspiration there, if you don't build the skills base behind it, the regulatory environment behind it, you know, it is, I mean, that's performative policy in some respects, isn't it?
Great. Okay. No, thank you very much. I'm going to now look at Asha and David. I don't know, do you want to have a stab at this, one of you?
Yeah, sure. I probably won't go through the 10 recommendations that came out of global report, Jeremy, but there are 2 things, because William has already picked up a few of what we've talked about in detail in the recommendations. But I would like to add a couple more to the 10 recommendations that we've discussed. The first of this is alignment. I think the alignment between the direction for whether it's net zero, whether it's low carbon, whether it's embracing sustainability or looking at it from a circularity lens, the alignment between consumer needs, industry, building regulations, and with that, capacity building for the building industry and the government, I think is very critical. So it's as much a political issue as it is a you know, a pressure driven by consumers and industry responding to this pressure. And then the second point that I'd like to make is, which I touched briefly in my presentation, is the issue around the performance, the actual performance. And I think, again, William has picked up on that point, because if you don't, you might have the best design intent. You might have a LEED Platinum building or a 6-star Green Star building, which are just designed and to some extent built intent, but they don't actually perform. And so if the building is not going to perform, then where's the confidence in the tools that we have in the marketplace? And what signals are we sending out into the marketplace? So I think the actual performance is a real test. And I think that actual performance also calls to the attention of all the players in the industry, the designers who design the building, hopefully to maximize passive design principles rather than using active systems, the builders who actually build the building, the facility managers that operate the buildings, the ESD consultants who have figured out all the details of how the systems ought to work and when they ought to work, etc. So I really think that the role of performance is critical for us to get to the next step as far as the industry is concerned.
Okay, thank you very much, Asha. I'll then come to David.
Thank you. Yes, well, I would like to see, I mean, circular economy is, I mean, everyone's on the bandwagon, and in Australia, we have different, you know, federal government, state governments have got circular economy hubs and whatever. And in Europe, and, you know, there's a huge amount of work, but I would like to see the focus turned not just to recycling and reuse, but what I was trying to say was that you know, the demand and having a sharp point to the circular economy, so that it actually reduces absolute consumption. And so that it's not just being circular and circulating things around, because the circular economy doesn't work when demand keeps increasing. So I really think that the circular economy policies need to have sufficiency at the cutting edge. So that's one thing I would like to see. And it was good that to hear that Will mention carbon budgets. I know that there's a lot of work going on in Europe, especially Northern Europe, on carbon budgets for buildings. And so the idea is there's a top-down approach. So starting with the country carbon budgets, it can be, there's a hierarchy from the top, the country budget, down to a sector budget, and it can even be carbon budgets for individual buildings and allocations. So I would like to see that that work much more widespread, and because in Australia, you know, in my city, I mean, we have we're ourselves carbon neutral, but in fact, it doesn't take into account all the buildings that are being constructed, all the new buildings. So, and so that the certifications and the accreditations need to change. So I think I might leave it there. But also in relation to top-down carbon budgets, the other approach is the more bottom-up, where the green building metrics, as I said, they need changing, because they're not an incentive to build less or consume less. And actually, I must say that the green building councils are very influential globally. But when you look at the rewards for buildings, there's no reward at all if you build less. You know what I mean? So because the business model for green building councils is based on how many buildings they certify. So of course they want to certify more buildings. So I think the whole system needs to be shaken up. So if I don't build at all, then I get 6 stars.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think that's a very interesting point, because if you look at professional fees, it's a percentage of the construction cost. If you look at fees for green buildings, it's based on a meter squared cost. You know, so there's an incentive to have a bigger building. So one of the interesting things, and there's a very nice question that's come through on the chat from Mark Butt, which is about economic drivers. And so what he asks is that if the construction industry and our kind of economic systems drive a certain behavior, you know, there's a certain set of economic drivers that are creating and actually making the problem worse. Don't we need to look at that? You know, surely if we're kind of looking at budgets and regulations and incentives, all of that's too late. That's the symptoms of a system that's going wrong. Shouldn't we be looking at different drivers that generate a much better system, much better environments, much better buildings to start off with, and not try when it's too late to give, you know, better performing buildings a few stars. So very nice question from Mark. Thank you for that question. Does anybody want to talk to that? Economic drivers?
I don't mind, although I'm not an economist. So let's take UK house building. UK house building is about adding value to land. It's not even about building houses. It's buying some land, doing something to it, and selling it on. And there is an industry that's basically been building the same thing for 60 years, and it only innovates really with stick. But I think that because it's an interaction, so really you have that pure economic driver of supply and demand. That's capitalism, you know, red in tooth and claw. But actually, what you have on one side is the regulatory, and that is improving in the UK, and I think it's improving in other countries. And I think, you know, certainly Scandinavian countries are still decades ahead of us in certain areas. I think what's happening on the other side is the consumer is starting to make different decisions. And I think, unfortunately, you know, to have a shift of consciousness towards a sustainable kind of consumer, that's taken a long time. But we're now starting, you know, energy consumption and sustainability is starting to be a question that people ask when they're house building. And the initial response to that is probably going to be performative. But if the consumer keeps asking hard questions and to some extent has some data and understands, and that's really about the frameworks that we put on that market to help the consumer make informed choices, then we will get a better product. The problem is it kind of does have to be regulatorily driven to start with, because it's the only way you shift the market quickly. And even then, you know, you get furious lobbying, and we can't do it. Construction industry is famous for it. Oh, we can't do that. It's too difficult. And then once the regulation comes, you find just how innovative they can be. So it's because it's risk, and that's really what the construction industry is about. So from my point of view, I think, you know, regulation, I think that a kind of shift of the, you know, the capitalist economic system is just something that will happen too slowly. So really getting quick and regulate firmly and pragmatically is probably the first place to go. But then on the other side, educate consumers. And we are starting to get that, you know, we start to get programs on TV about energy efficient buildings. Then people will start asking for those things. And I would say, you know, we're still an early adopter on the Rogers curve, but once you start moving up there, and, you know, people start asking questions about new build houses and make choices of one over another, that's when the market responds.
Okay, great. No, thank you for that. Asha, David, do you want to comment on kind of economic drivers at all?
I just wondered, Jeremy, if I could share. I don't know if there's anybody in your audience that's from Australia, but there's an interesting set of events happening here. So as a result of, one of the during the COVID period, one of the recovery packages that was initiated by the government was to give throw more money at the building sector. So renovations over 125,000, I think it was, Australian dollars, got subsidies from the Australian government. And so a lot of during the COVID period, as houses were being constructed, a lot of the contracts were based on fixed price contracts. And then we've had problems with supply chain during the COVID period. We had the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal for I don't know how many months. That has had an impact. So as a result, the materials is almost unavailable in the market here, and the tradies have had to move, and builders have had to move from standard timber construction, because timber is more or less not available, to steel. And so that has created problems, and the disruption in the supply chain has caused houses to be half built or not built. This is putting pressure on the tradies. So one of our largest house builders, Metricon, the word on the street is that they're having serious financial problems. A number of small tradies have seriously gone bankrupt. So there's, so the government, in its best intentions to actually support the industry, has ended up creating a problem, which of course was unforeseen, and resulted due to the supply chain problems because of the pandemic. So it's a really interesting situation, and this is going to have, so if a major house builder collapses, you can imagine what the situation is going to be with the number of subcontractors and tradies. It's going to be an absolutely terrible situation, and the next 2 or 3 months is going to be very critical.
Okay. No,
so there's your economic impact, right? There's your direct economic impact.
No, absolutely. But I think also the point is because there's a interruption, there's a change in the supply chain, that automatically changes the economic drivers, which is a very interesting point, which you make. David, do you want to say anything about economic drivers?
Yes, please. Just following up from what Usha said, the governments tend to throw money around for new construction. We're going to build, so many thousand new houses, but very rarely do you hear them say, "Oh, we're going to, we're going to fix up, we're going to retrofit," like Will's area. Yeah, I think there needs to be a big shift in policies and government programs to manage our existing stock. I mean, Walter Starhill, who talks about what have I done here? Sorry.
We can hear you. Don't. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, Walter Starhill, founder of the circular economy, he talks about a lot about maintaining the stock and looking, stewardship of the stock. But when it comes to politicians, that doesn't win you votes, because if you say, I'm going to build like happened in my city, one of the parties said, oh, we're going to build a huge new stadium, then, a lot of people, might vote for them, and the politicians like to see themselves cutting red tape, opening new buildings. But there's very few politicians who might, see votes and value in refurbishing and repurposing the existing stock. There's going to be, there already is, certainly in Australia, in my city, there's a lot of vacant space in city buildings, and with COVID, that worsened the situation. So, there are a whole lot of businesses gone out of business. So there really needs to be a big program to make better use of that space. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there. But just one other point, Will mentioned consumers. I actually think we should stop talking about consumers. We should be talking about customers for services. So I wanted to make that point, because we've got to educate people to get away from the thinking that by consuming more, they're better off. But as I mentioned, in France with that ADEME organisation, they put out the message that you can be better off by consuming less. The same as if you consume less food, it's good for your health and yeah. So and it's good for your pocket. So we have to get the narratives out there about consuming less. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that we've got some very nice points really around economic drivers. So I think what David is saying is, change what are the kind of key objectives, what are the key issues, instead of kind of growth and development. Look at quality, look at better environments. I think the point William made was, if you want to drive it quickly, you've got to tilt the playing field, and you've got to use regulation, and you've got to drive it quite hard and quite quickly. And then I think the point Asha made was that at the same time, if the systems, supply chain systems, etc., get disrupted, you have unintended consequences. So you've got to keep those kind of 3 or 4 things in balance, and then use that to drive change. So some kind of very nice points. There's another question that's come through. This is from Steph. And this is the point about digital infrastructure. And I think it relates very much to what's been happening in the last 2 or 3 years around COVID, where there's been a huge shift in the way people work, the living and working patterns of billions of people. People just work and live differently. So there's been a huge number of people who have stayed at home, who haven't commuted, who have used the internet, used distant working, and been very innovative about keeping work patterns going. And what is very interesting about that is how productive and actually, many companies have grown, many have kept afloat, despite, kind of huge economic problems. The second thing that is really important about that is people have realized that they don't necessarily have to follow, those conventional patterns about how you live and how you work and commute, for 3 hours a day in cars and sit on highways. And we see also the impact of that in the figures. So I'm sure everybody has seen some of those graphs of, what happened to air travel, which kind of dropped hugely, what happened to transportation, what happened to energy consumption, etc. And so we saw literally overnight up to 20% drops in carbon emissions. And what that shows, and it's very important, what that shows is it shows that it's possible. I think a lot of the kind of comments that have been made by the panelists is that the pushback always is it's not possible, it's too difficult. Actually, it isn't. We can see that the level of change is possible. You can have very radical change happening. So one of the kind of last kind of questions that I want to just ask the panel to respond to is this idea now that we're actually getting to a point where people will resign rather than go back to some of the old patterns. There's this whole kind of great resignation. Microsoft can't find people, Google can't find people. They're paying interns, huge amounts of money to try and employ them. And it's because people have realized that quality of life can be better. and they value that. And if you look at cities like what's happening in Paris in terms of this, 5 minute, 15-minute city, it's starting to filter through into the way cities are designed, neighborhoods are designed. So everything is happening at a far more local level. So one of the things I just wanted to kind of throw back to the panelists is we've talked about regulations, we've talked about economic drivers. What's the role of personal choice and people just following their own feet and walking and changing how they do things? Because if we think about kind of consumers and companies, they follow the market. So what's the role of society and individuals and families and neighborhoods in terms of creating change rapidly, in terms of what we need for 2030? Any...
Jamie, I'm happy to have the first stab at it.
Okay, have a go, yeah.
If you like. I think there's two issues here. One is the choice really, I think, is for the knowledge workers. So those who can, who needn't travel into work to work, so they can use their home offices, or they can use another space in which they could sit in a cafe, somewhere, and they could do the work. So I think they're the people that have actually the ability to make those choices. But then there's this other cohort who have no choice but to go into work, and they are the hospitality workers, the healthcare workers, and perhaps workers in casual employment who are forced to go into their place of employment to work. So for them, really nothing has changed. And I think the conundrum really is with the knowledge workers. I don't think, at least, in Melbourne, we've been saying that it's been the city that has had the longest lockdown ever, and rightly so, because we've been in and out of lockdowns for so long. The city, I don't think, is ever going to be the same again. And part of the reason why the central business district was as alive as it was because we had a lot of transient student population. We had, at any given time over the last 7-8 years, we had over 100,000 international students in the city, and within a span of a few weeks, as a result of COVID, all that was gone. So the question really is, what and how do we use this? A lot of businesses have come back, but it's hybrid arrangements. Nobody really is working 5 days a week. Most people are working 2 days or 3 days a week. So what other opportunities exist? So businesses have actually shrunk the use of their flow space areas. So there's a healthy debate going on as to what do we use these other spaces for. Could we house the homeless, for instance? What are the parameters that need to be considered? So there's no resolution, but it's certainly an interesting debate that Melburnians are having at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm noticing we're getting to the end of our allotted time. So I think what I'm going to suggest is that William and David, I think on that point, are there anything that you want to mention on that particular issue?
I can be really quick. I actually do think, actually COVID has intensified an inequality between knowledge workers and other workers. I do think the city was drifting a little bit towards live, work, play anyway, and that more neighbourhood model. I've certainly seen it in the UK. Yeah, I think I'm with Mao on this. It's probably too early to tell just where that will transpire, and I think there's nothing yellows faster than a sort of prediction of the future. So I'll be honest and say I don't know.
Okay, thank you. David?
Yes, I just wanted to thank Usha, because that's the first time I've heard mention of, the differences between knowledge workers and the tradespeople and cleaners. And so thank you for highlighting that. I think that's very important. And also I think, we're going to have a big problem around the globe, probably in cities where people spend more of their time close to their home, in suburbs. They live, work and play close to home. So yeah, as Usha also mentioned, what's the future for the cities and the buildings, and are they stranded assets? What can we do with them? So I think that's, they could be just end up as dinosaurs, So anyway, that's, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I see it's now 4 o'clock here. It may be something else altogether where you are, but we've reached the end of our 2-hour slot. So I think on my side, I would like to thank the panelists. So David, Asha, Will, thank you very much for your time, for engaging on all sorts of questions and points that came through and responding to that. Thank you very much to Michael, Don, Debbie from the CIB for putting the technology together. We didn't have any glitches, so thank you very much for that. I think, Michael, you've recorded this session. So I think if there's 2 things I just wanted to end on. Firstly, if anyone's interested in seeing the presentations and the recording, I think Michael might be able to let you know where to access that. And the second thing is that part of the point of these seminars is to encourage further debate and interaction. So Will, Asha, David are all W116 members. Very easy to get hold of, to contact. What we want to come out of these sessions is building links, building interaction, looking at joint research projects, joint publications, so that we get going with a lot of these issues more quickly, and build those networks. So please do get in touch with the panelists. You're welcome to get in touch with me. And I'm just going to hand over, I think, to Michael to close. But lastly, thank you very much to the audience and the questions. We've had some very nice questions. I hope we've dealt with the more important ones. And we look forward to the next one, and to you coming to that. So Michael, I think I'm just going to hand over to you to close.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Jeremy, and the Commission on Smart and Sustainable Built Environment, and our presenters today. Very challenging, very thought-provoking, just a great panel, great questions from our audience, and a great moderator, Jeremy. So thank you all so much. I put the YouTube channel link into the chat, and we'll get this published by the end of the week. So thank you so much on behalf of Don, Debbie, and I. We're very grateful for this presentation. Thank you so much.